Meet Thomas Wharton, a 6-year-old boy who is about to begin his educational career at Mavis Public School and is very excited. Thomas comes from an Indigenous family who are considered a low socio-economic family. Mr. and Mrs. Wharton, Thomas's parents, are both extremely hardworking, and they instilled a love of literacy in Thomas by reading to him when he was younger, as well as a love for animals and nature. However, in the more recent years, they have become too busy to worry about Thomas's academic status, especially because Thomas's older brother, Blake, is continually getting in trouble at school and taking up most of his parents' attention. Blake is now in Year 3 at school, and his kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Pegler, still considers him to be one of the most disruptive students she has ever taught. She would frequently complain about him in the staff room, with attitudes affirming her belief that it's always the students from poor families who are disruptive, taking an approach that blamed the students' home life for their undesirable behaviour and lower academic achievements, with a firm belief that these students could not be changed and will end up as high school dropouts. When Mrs. Pegler discovered she would be teaching Thomas this year, she was extremely disappointed and instantly began a behaviour management plan for Thomas that would hinder his classroom contribution and ultimately be detrimental to his learning, but she did not care as long as he would not disrupt her classroom. Before Thomas had even had his first day of school, he was negatively impacted by the notion of deficit discourse, which can be described as disempowering patterns of thought, language, and practice that represent people in terms of deficiencies and failures. It particularly refers to discourse that places responsibility for problems with the affected individuals or communities, overlooking the larger socio-economic structures in which they are embedded. If we have another look at Blake, it is evident that deficit discourse has created a future of learning that is riddled with stereotyping, with his identity being defined in negative terms. Mrs. Pegler never discussed his socio-economic disadvantage or ways to alleviate it, and this trend still follows him. Thomas begins school with enthusiasm and an eagerness to learn and socialise. However, he is finding it hard as he is always isolated from his peers, as his enthusiasm is instantly disregarded as disruptive behaviour by Mrs. Pegler. This discourse was soon shared by other teaching staff, and Thomas was confused as to why teachers would continually dismiss his classroom and playground contributions. The longer this went on, the more Thomas began to dislike school and his interest dissolved. His anger and frustration increased, causing him to act out and behave in a disruptive manner, implying that the teachers were right in their assumptions of Thomas, that he is exactly like his brother. This continued up until Thomas reached Year 3, where Mrs. White, a new graduate teacher, was taking his class. Mrs. White had a teaching philosophy that incorporated the first point of the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers, know students and how they learn. To do this, she introduced an idea from Pat Thompson's teachings of the virtual school bag. This is a metaphor for the things students have already learned at home, with their friends, and in and from the world they live in. Mrs. White begins the school year and finds her class to be reasonably interested and engaged, all except for Thomas. Despite what she has heard from other teachers, she can see enormous potential in Thomas and decides to schedule a meeting with both Thomas and his parents. Here she finds out all about his virtual school bag, which includes his Indigenous culture, a love of reading and literacy, as well as a love of animals, nature, and the outdoors. Mr. and Mrs. Wharton are shocked to find out Thomas has been disruptive at school, as no teacher had ever bothered to get to know him or his family before. With her newfound knowledge, Mrs. White knows that students are usually dependent on their teachers for explicit teaching and guided learning opportunities, and she can now incorporate turnaround pedagogies based on Thomas's interests. Turnaround pedagogies are the way educators redesign the implementation of curriculum to directly reflect their students' preferred learning styles. This helps engage students who previously struggled with learning. Using the contents of Thomas's virtual school bag, Mrs. White began to implement strategies that were beneficial to her whole class. Firstly, she organised a month-long book Olympics at a whole school level in which students read as many books at home to earn medals at school. 10 minutes is dedicated every day to students who want to discuss the books they have read, and all library books are available in case students do not have any at home. A science unit was developed based on Thomas's love of nature and animals that focuses on the living world. Finally, Indigenous culture is taught during history in a much less tokenistic sense, as Mrs. White has taken the time to communicate and collaborate with local members of the Indigenous community, as well as professional learning that strengthened her knowledge of how to support and implement this into her teaching. Within weeks, it was evident that Thomas felt appreciated in the classroom and a love of learning was beginning to develop.